The scream that tore through the midnight air did not sound like any horse Walter Chapman had known in 72 years of ranching. It wasn't a whinny or a neigh. It was something deeper, rawer, something that felt like it came from the bottom of a wounded soul. Walter grabbed his robe and flashlight, his knees aching as he rushed through the cold darkness toward his barn. His heart pounded fast, not from running, but from the kind of fear that hits a man who has already lost too much. When he threw open the barn doors, the lights revealed chaos. The massive black Shire he had brought home only hours earlier was destroying everything in sight. The horse kicked the stall walls with terrifying force. Wood cracked. Splinters flew. The stall door bent under the pressure. Foam dripped from the horse's mouth and his black coat was soaked with sweat. His eyes were wild and lost, locked on some nightmare Walter couldn't see. In that moment, Walter understood why no one else had bid on him. 12 hours earlier felt like a lifetime ago. The autumn sun hung low over the county fairgrounds as Walter stood at the back of the crowd, leaning on the wooden rail. He hadn't planned on coming to the livestock auction. His ranch had been mostly empty since his wife Evelyn passed 3 years ago. He had sold nearly all his horses except 2 old quarter horses who stayed more out of habit than usefulness. But something had pulled him to the auction yard that morning. Maybe loneliness, maybe memory, maybe hope. A sleek mare trotted through the ring and sold for $8,000. Walter watched without envy. Those kinds of horses were for younger ranchers with big dreams. He was here just to feel the old life again, the life he had once shared with Evelyn. Then a strange silence fell over the crowd. A massive black Shire draft, tall as a doorway and built like a moving mountain, limped into the ring. His coat was dull, ribs showing. His hooves were cracked, his head hung low. The scars across his shoulders and flanks told a story nobody wanted to hear. Even from a distance, the fear in the horse's eyes made people step back. "Lot 67, the auctioneer said with no excitement at all. "Shire gelding, about 8 years old. Needs work. Sold as is. Who'll start at 500. Nobody spoke. This was the kind of horse that should have brought thousands. But the crowd shifted, muttered, kept their hands down. Something was wrong. Very wrong. 200. The auctioneer tried again. Silence. Walter felt a strange pull. He moved closer, his heartbeat picking up. Up close, the horse was even more impressive, and even more broken. He towered over the rail, yet carried himself like he wanted to disappear. But his eyes, those eyes, held more than fear. They held pain so deep it was almost human. $50? The auctioneer said at last. A $50 Shire draft. It didn't make sense. Walter's hand lifted, then froze. He was living on a fixed income. He was too old to take on a horse that looked like trouble. He couldn't even be sure the animal was safe. His fingers touched his vest pocket. Inside lay his grandfather's 1890 Waltham pocket watch. Solid gold, worth $1,500. The last valuable thing he owned. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Wait!" Walter called out. Heads turned. Whispers rose like wind through dry grass. "I don't have $50 on me," Walter said, "but I have this." He held up the pocket watch. Sunlight hit the gold and a low gasp rolled through the crowd. Everyone knew the watch. Everyone knew its worth. And everyone knew Walter had never parted with it, even when times got hard. "Sir," the auctioneer began, "that watch is worth far more than this horse." "I know what it's worth," Walter said, voice firm. "If the seller agrees, it's a fair trade." The seller, Vernon Gisham, nodded so fast it was clear he just wanted the horse gone. "Sold!" the auctioneer shouted. Whispers exploded around the ring as Walter approached the big Shire. The horse lifted his head. For a brief moment their eyes met. Walter did not see danger. He saw heartbreak. Getting the horse home had been harder than anything Walter expected. The Shire, named Griffin, barely fit in his small trailer. But he loaded calmly, almost too calmly, as if he had stopped fighting the world. At home, Griffin limped into his stall and stood like a statue. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, He didn't even look around. He simply existed, heavy with something Walter couldn't name. That night, as Walter tried to sleep, the first scream shattered the quiet. He ran to the barn and watched the giant horse thrash violently in the grip of a nightmare, kicking, striking, crashing into every wall around him. But even in his fury, Griffin never put full weight on his injured leg. There was pain in him, physical and something deeper. When the episode finally ended, Griffin collapsed onto the straw, shaking, breathing hard. His eyes opened. They found Walter. And in those eyes, Walter saw the truth. This wasn't rage. This was despair. Walter stood there until sunrise, watching over the horse he had traded everything for. Now, he understood why nobody else would take him. But it wasn't enough to make Walter turn away. Not yet. Not when something in Griffin's broken soul matched something broken in his owl. The next morning, the ranch felt colder than usual, as if the night's terror still hung in the air. Walter moved slowly toward the barn, unsure what he would find. Griffin stood in the corner of his stall, head low, eyes empty. The destruction around him looked worse in daylight. Straw covered the aisle. Boards were cracked. A water bucket lay crushed under one massive hoof, but the horse himself, he looked defeated, like he didn't know whether to fear Walter or beg him for help. Walter spoke softly. "Morning, big fella. You're safe here." Griffin didn't move, but his ears turned slightly toward Walter. It was the smallest sign, yet enough to push the old rancher forward. For now, he wouldn't try grooming or touching. Just showing up mattered. After giving Griffin hay and water, Walter drove into town. He needed answers. The Dusty Spur diner was already half full when he walked in. Betty, the longtime waitress and unofficial newskeeper of the county, filled his cup before he sat down. "You really did it, didn't you?" she said quietly. "You took that Shire home." "Seems that way," Walter said. Betty's expression tightened. "Walter, do you know what happened with that horse?" "No. That's why I'm here." She glanced around, then sat beside him, something she rarely did unless the story was serious. "That horse belonged to Clayton Mills." Walter felt a cold shift in his stomach. Everybody knew Clayton. A rough stock contractor with money, power, and a temper known across 3 counties. 6 months ago, Betty continued, Clayton was training him, pushing him too hard. Some say too cruelly. Something happened in the arena that day. She swallowed. When they found Clayton, he was dead, trampled. Walter didn't speak. He let the words settle. "The sheriff called it an accident," Betty said. "But Clayton's hired hand swears that horse went after him. Like he'd finally had enough." Walter pictured Griffin's scars, his fear, his eyes full of pain. "After that," Betty said, lowering her voice, "they tried to put him down, called him dangerous. But Clayton's daughter refused, claimed her father treated animals like machines. She said whatever happened, the horse didn't deserve to die for it. And then they forced the hand to sell him 3 different auctions. Nobody wanted him. People said he was cursed, that he'd kill again." Walter stared at the dark surface of his coffee, a killer horse or a tortured one pushed past his limit. He knew what cruelty could do to living things. He'd seen it in cattle, in horses, even in men. But he also knew what kindness could repair. He thanked Betty and drove home, the weight of the story sinking deeper with every mile. If what she said was true, then Griffin had every reason to fear humans. And every reason to lose faith. Walter parked the truck and walked toward the barn. Griffin stood with his head out over the stall door, watching him. It wasn't a welcome exactly, but it wasn't fear either. Walter stopped a few feet away. "I know what happened," he said gently. "I know what they think you did." The horse's ears flicked. "I don't blame you," Walter continued. "A creature can only take so much. I won't hurt you. I won't force you. But if you'll let me, I'd like to help." He lifted his hand and placed it on the stall door. Griffin hesitated. Then slowly, painfully, he stretched his neck forward until his muzzle touched Walter's hand. Soft, warm, trembling. It was the first small step toward trust. The next week, Walter built a routine. Quiet mornings, slow movements, talking in a calm voice that filled the barn with steady warmth. Griffin stayed cautious, but he began to eat while Walter was nearby. He stopped pinning his ears every time the old man entered the stall. And though he still tensed whenever Walter moved suddenly, the terror in his eyes softened bit by bit. On the 7th day, Walter called Doc Renshaw, the county's large animal vet. "You're crazy for taking that horse," Doc said. "You know that, right?" "Probably," Walter answered. "But will you take a look at him?" Doc arrived with enough sedatives to quiet a bull, but he didn't need them. Griffin stayed tense, but steady as the vet approached. It took patience and gentle words, but finally Doc managed to examine the injured leg. "It's not broken," Doc said at last, "but he's got a bad tendon injury, likely from being pushed too hard. And this," he tapped gently on the leg, "is an old bone fracture that healed wrong." "Can he recover?" Walter asked. Doc sighed. "He'll never pull heavy loads again. But he can live a comfortable life if he gets the right care. The bigger problem is in his head. This horse has seen things he shouldn't have. He's scared of being hurt again." Walter nodded. "Then we heal his mind, too." Doc chuckled softly. "You always were stubborn, Chapman. Don't get yourself killed." The following days brought small progress. Griffin stopped flinching when Walter entered the stall. He began to raise his head when he heard Walter's voice. Even his nightmares grew less violent, though they still visited him in the darkest hours. Then came the breakthrough Walter didn't expect. 3 weeks after Griffin arrived, Walter opened the stall door like he always did. Until now, the big gelding had stayed inside, unsure of the world beyond those walls. But that morning, as sunlight spilled into the barn, Griffin took one step forward, then another. Then he walked out into the barn aisle. Slow, limping, but free. Walter didn't move. He let the horse explore. Griffin sniffed the walls, the feed bins, the empty stalls. He touched noses with Rusty and Penny gently, as if introducing himself to the herd. Then his eyes found Walter. Walter opened the barn door and stepped back into the sunlight. "You want to see outside?" he asked softly. Griffin followed. The moment his hooves touched the open yard, he lifted his head. His black coat shone under the sun. The cold air filled his lungs. He stood quietly, turning his face toward the sky like he hadn't seen the world in a long time. Walter watched from a distance, his throat tight. That giant, broken horse was standing in the light again. It felt like the first real sign of hope. Winter crept in earlier than usual, bringing sharp winds and a thin layer of frost across the ranch. By then, Griffin had settled into a gentle routine. Each morning he stepped out of his stall on his own, limping less with every passing day. His coat slowly regained its shine. His muscles filled out. His eyes, once empty shadows, now held a quiet strength. But the biggest change came in the way he watched over everything. Walter noticed it the first time Rusty began coughing. Griffin stood guard outside Rusty's stall and refused to move until Walter fetched warm mash and medicine. When coyotes roamed near the fence line, Griffin positioned himself between the pasture and the threat. He didn't chase them. He didn't panic. He simply stood, tall, steady, unshakable. He had gone from survivor to protector. Then came the morning everything changed. Walter woke with a sharp ache in his knees, the kind that warned of snow. He moved slower than usual toward the barn. Halfway there, he heard Griffin scream. It wasn't the scream of terror that haunted the early days. It was an urgent call, loud and sharp, cutting through the cold air. Walter hurried, heart pounding. Inside the barn, Rusty lay on his side. His leg was wedged tight in the corner of his stall, blood pooling beneath him. The old quarter horse thrashed weakly, eyes wide with fear. But what shocked Walter was the open stall doors. Griffin had broken out of his own stall, then forced Rusty's door open too. Fresh hoofprints showed he had stepped inside long enough to try helping the struggling horse before backing out and calling for Walter. "You did good," Walter whispered as he rushed past Griffin. "You did real good." It took nearly 15 minutes to get Rusty free. Griffin never left the doorway. He watched every move, his massive shadow covering the stall entrance like a shield. Only after Rusty stood again, shaking but safe, did the big Shire lower his head and let out a soft breath, almost like relief. Walter placed a hand on the horse's broad chest. "You saved his life. You called me. You stayed with him." His voice cracked. "You're no devil horse. You're a guardian." Griffin nuzzled Walter's shoulder gently, the first true sign of affection he had shown without fear. From that day on, something shifted between them. Griffin no longer stood at a distance. He began greeting Walter at the stall door each morning. He followed him in the barnyard like a dog with too much dignity to admit it. He rested his head on Walter's shoulder while the old man brushed his coat. He let Walter clean his hooves and wrap the injured leg. The barn no longer echoed with rage or nightmares. It held peace again. Word spread through town faster than fire in dry grass. The devil horse from the auctions had become the gentle giant at Walter Chapman's ranch. Folks talked. Some doubted. Some wanted to see him with their own eyes. One cold December afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. A young woman stepped out, wrapped in a city coat far too light for a Wyoming winter. Her eyes looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Chapman," she asked. "I'm Rebecca Mills." Clayton Mills was my father. Walter froze. He didn't know what to expect. Anger? Demands? Blame? Instead, Rebecca's voice trembled. "I heard someone finally took Griffin in. I had to see him. I had to know he was safe." Inside the barn, Griffin stood in the sunlight, leaking through the open door. When he saw her, his ears flicked forward, curious but calm. Rebecca approached the fence slowly. Her breath caught when Griffin stepped closer and lowered his head toward her. "He remembers me," she whispered. "I always tried to be gentle with him. My father—" She paused, tears gathering. "My father didn't treat animals kindly. I left home because of it." She reached out, touching Griffin's scarred face with a trembling hand. "I'm sorry," she said softly to the horse. "I'm sorry for everything you went through." Griffin stood still, letting her cry into his mane. Before she left, she handed Walter an envelope. Inside was a check for $2,000. "You traded your grandfather's watch for him," she said. "Everyone knows that watch's story. This doesn't replace it, but please let me do something right, connected to my father." Walter tried to refuse, but she insisted until he accepted with a nod. As her car disappeared down the road, Walter walked back to Griffin. Snow began falling, soft and quiet. Griffin's warm breath fogged the air as he pressed his face gently against Walter's chest. "You're home now," Walter whispered, "and so am I." They stood in the falling snow, man and horse, both once broken, both healing in ways they never expected. In the evenings, Walter sat on the porch watching Griffin graze. The Shire's coat glowed gold in the lowering sun. His white feathering danced in the breeze. He looked like something out of an old story, a noble creature who had suffered, survived, and risen again. Walter thought about the pocket watch, the last piece of family history he had traded away. He thought about the day people at the auction had whispered behind his back, calling him a fool. But as he watched Griffin lift his head and look toward him with trust instead of fear, he smiled. "I think I got the better end of that deal," he said. Griffin's ears perked, as if agreeing. Night settled over the ranch, gentle and calm. For the first time in years, Walter felt whole again. He had given a broken horse a second chance, and in return, Griffin had given him purpose, hope, and the reminder that healing doesn't happen alone. It happens when two wounded souls find each other at the exact moment they both need saving.